We've now learned already in 2018, when it comes to cabinet reshuffles, I mean, it is the proverbial piss up in a brewery, isn't it?
I completely disagree with you, Andrew. What we've had is a new cabinet that is focusing on the Prime Minister's priorities, particularly housing, social care. We've got new female members of cabinet, which are fantastic to see.
You haven't got any
really
more.
Good colleagues. No, but we have some fresh faces, and let's be very clear, what the Prime Minister was setting out to achieve was to improve the pipeline of newer, younger members of Parliament who are incredibly diverse, many more women.
No, I take that at the lower levels, you've got more diverse, but look, you say this is it's not a new cabinet, because the big beasts haven't changed. We perhaps even include yourself in that. There's no more women than before in the cabinet. There's no change in the racial diversity of the cabinet. There's actually a net loss of one LGBT cabinet minister, Justin Greening. There's actually fewer from comprehensives. Fewer non-Oxbridge. How is this a new cabinet for the 21st century?
But I think that is to miss the point. The cabinet is, of course, a very core part of government, but so too are the Whitehall teams. And at the junior ministerial level,
not change more?
Because you do need to give people the opportunity to get some experience, to understand the machinery of government. We've got some fantastic new people into departments who are now at Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State level, at Minister of State level.
Just not in the cabinet.
No, but the point is they are very much integral to policy development, to policy thinking, to new ideas. And of course, the next step is, with that experience, they then will be looking at cabinet posts.
Some of them have been around for quite a while.
No, I don't think you should just look at the cabinet and judge the reshuffle just
Andrew
on that.
Leveson, you mentioned the cabinet in your first answer to my question. You mentioned the cabinet, not me. So I told you what had changed in the cabinet, which is very little. What does it say of the Prime Minister that she wasn't strong enough to move her health secretary?
I don't think that any of us know exactly what happens in those conversations. I think
no, we do. She tried to move him and he said he wouldn't go.
Jeremy Hunt has been doing an incredibly good job in health.
So why did she try to move him?
Determined to take on the challenge of resolving social care. Great news that we're all living longer, but nevertheless the challenge of social care is added to his role. I don't know that she tried to move him.
You don't? You must be the only person in the country that doesn't. Where have you been?
I think the press have certainly speculated on that, but that doesn't mean...
Downing Street and Mr Hunt's people have briefed the press. That's why they're saying it. Did she try to move you?
I had a very brief and very pleasant and cordial conversation with the Prime Minister where she told me there's a lot of important work to do, and she asked me to stay in my job, and I told her I was delighted to do so.
So she didn't mention moving you?
She did not.
Were you nervous that she might? Because you were tweeting a lot beforehand. You were sort of playing for position, weren't you?
No, not at all. I was perfectly relaxed about my position.
All right. On the lower ranks, the minions, if I can call them that, there is a big change in the diversity. And these will probably be the Tory cabinet ministers of tomorrow. Does that worry you?
No, I think we should welcome any increase in diversity at all levels within government. However, you've raised the points already, Andrew. In terms of the cabinet, that's not the case. If you compare that to our shadow cabinet, which has 50% women, a range of ages, and then people from across BME groups as well. So it is quite a difference. And again, your point around a shambolic reshuffle is absolutely well made, because, you know, we had Chris Grayling as the chairman, then he wasn't.
Well, that was a good Tory headquarters.
It's still shambolic,
they're still trying to get to grips with social media, I'm told. or the quill pen. I'm not sure they quite mastered that.
But anyway, the point that Andrew's just made around Jeremy Hunt doing a good job and being retained in his position. I mean, look at the... I'm sure
we'll come on. Let me stop you there, not because I wish not you to talk about that, but we're coming on to it, as you would expect us to do. Because with the reshuffle done, it's now time, of course, for Theresa May and her team to get on with the job, as they say. There won't be much of a breather for the new cabinet, because the Prime Minister's got to refocus onto the domestic agenda. So what are the government's priorities for the year ahead? Here's Elizabeth Glinker with the details. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, Theresa May began the year saying that fixing the housing crisis was her personal mission. She promptly added it to the Community Secretary Sajid Javid's title. Jeremy Hunt continues on at health amidst a crisis in the NHS. He was forced to apologise last week after he approved approved the cancellation of 55,000 non-urgent operations until February. He also adds social care to his brief, with a white paper due by the summer. Meanwhile, the ink was barely dry on Justine Greening's social mobility strategy before she left her post as Education Secretary this week. So one question is, will her successor, Damien Hinds, pick up where she left off? But despite the push on domestic policy, Brexit will inevitably dominate this year's agenda. In the Commons, the trade bill received its second reading yesterday, and the EU withdrawal bill will be back in front of MPs again later this month. There will be a new immigration bill later this year. And that is all before the government needs to conclude its negotiations with Brussels by October if a deal is to pass all the democratic hurdles in time for the UK to leave in March next year. As the Cabinet only met just before Christmas to discuss what that final deal might look like, the clock is certainly ticking. Andrew.
Thanks for that. So we're going to look at the Conservatives first and then come to Labour. Let's start with the Conservatives, and Andrea led some. Since the election in June of last year, and putting aside Brexit issues, what's the government achieved?
Well, certainly right across a range of portfolio areas. So to take the NHS first, which is an absolutely priority, not just for the government, but for everybody in the country, we've seen huge efforts made to try and solve the issue of delayed transfer, so freeing up many more beds for people. And there's more work to be done there. Well, no, it's not solved, but it's gone a long way towards being solved.
Really? Well, hold on. You've just cancelled 55,000 operations.
That's a slightly different issue. The delayed transfer of care is the issue sometimes known as bed blocking, where people can't get out.
And because you haven't resolved enough of that, you're having to cancel non-urgent operations to free up beds.
I think the key thing here to remember is that the demands on the NHS in the winter are always increased. That is an inevitable part. And so always what the NHS staff seek to do is to prioritise the urgent over the routine operations. And that's, so in winter, it is very difficult. We have been
Winter's
better
never a
prepared.
surprise, though, is it?
No, it's not a surprise.
It does come around November every year.
Absolutely.
It doesn't go till maybe late March. And the one thing that isn't seasonal is the current situation in which 1 in 10 nursing posts are now vacant. 1 in 10.
Well,
why?
Since 2010, there has been an increase in the numbers of nurses on wards. I don't know where that figure you've got has come from, Andrew, but
they're official
there
figures.
is an
one in
increase
10 nursing,
in the number of nurses of about 10,000.
No, that you may have, but there are 45,000 unfilled clinical roles in the NHS, of which 40,000 are in nursing. Now, if you're naming the NHS as an achievement, why?
So, I mean, as I say, the numbers that you're giving, I'm not sure whether you're talking about registered to nurse or actual
I'm talking about qualified nurses.
And obviously there is
a 50% rise in the number of nurses quitting compared to 2014.
I think there you're talking about deregistering. I think there is.
No, I'm talking about nurses quitting because they don't feel they're paid enough or not wanted enough or don't get the tools to do the job. I mean, let me bring it down to a practical example. A prestige hospital in Oxford is now saying it will have to stop giving chemotherapy or reduce chemotherapy to people who are dying.
That is incredibly worrying, but you will also be aware that commissioning group has said that they are not, in fact, doing that at all. It was apparently a leaked email. I don't know the details of that story, but
what they're saying is that that is in the plan to do because of, and the reason I bring it is it's staff shortages. They are down. This is a hospital. These aren't global figures. This is a real hospital, actually in one of the richest parts of the country too. 40% of the establishment nurses are down. They're down 40% on what it should be, which is why they've had to talk about delaying chemotherapy, which is a terrible thing to go through anyway, and then to be told it's going to be delayed.
I completely agree. It is incredibly worrying to hear that. But I just say again, that trust have said that that is not the case. So just to be clear about
they've said that this is what they'll have to do if the staffing shortage doesn't change. It hasn't happened yet. You're quite right.
Exactly.
And in a sense, that was not
their
quite
intention to do
bigged
that.
up in the Times story. But the head of the hospital has said that they will have to make cuts to treatment of the terminally ill.
They have not said that. And just to be clear, there are 10,000 more nurses now than there were in 2010.
But
we have
still
a
1
big
in 10
recruitment
vacant.
drive. We have a huge recruitment drive for more nursing staff and for more GPs. There are new nursing bursaries. There is much more support for people wanting to come into the profession, and it's quite right that we do that. But nevertheless, I just want to say again...
Would you like to... I mean, we got to this because I asked you, other than Brexit and everything associated with that, what's the government achieved? And you surprised me. You mentioned the NHS. Having heard these figures and seen what's happening, would you like to reconsider that?
No, I think the NHS is doing an incredible job. We have just been, again, for the second year in a row, called the best health system in the world by the Commonwealth Fund.
The Commonwealth Fund is an American fund that wants it wants America to adopt a British system. So it always finds the British system is the best. I'm saying it sees health through a particular British-style comprehensive health focus. There's no harm in that, but it's one of the reasons why we don't come out best in other subs. When you talk about the NHS and the Labour side, it's basically just more money, isn't it? There's nothing else you would do.
No, that's not correct at all. But you are absolutely right. We know that we have the lowest level of funding as a percentage of GDP since 1951. It's absolutely chronic. It's not me saying that. There are a whole host of peer-reviewed articles in the BMJ and other such publications.
The overall funding is at a record level.
In terms of cash sums, yes.
Well, in real terms.
But in terms,
yes. In real terms, it's high.
But in terms of percentage of GDP, it is not. We are again, as we were in the 1990s, below the EU average, and this is having a significant impact. Again, as I say, I reiterate the articles that are in the BMJ and elsewhere showing that this is the real issue.
I understand.
And as you say, impacting on clinical posts, 100,000 across the piece, which
but just to be clear, I've stuck with the NHS because it is winter and it's such an important subject for everybody. Everybody depends on the NHS at some stage. But other than putting more money, and the government would say it has put more money in, what single big change would you make to make it function better?
We do need to make sure that we keep transforming the NHS. We are in a...
But what would you do?
Well, particularly in terms of we've had for a number of years a purchase-provider split. We know that is impacting in terms of efficiency
but would you reverse
within the
all
NHS.
that?
We would want to see. So, for example, we know there are 20 billion contracts that have gone out to the private health sector since 2013, since the dreadful privatisation.
Slower rate of growth than went out under the last Labour government.
No, that's not the
Yes.
case. I'm sorry, that's not the case. If you look at
so you would reverse all privatisation?
We know the evidence again, Andrew, is that marketisation, privatisation within the health system, it reduces access. Can I just finish the point? Reduces access to healthcare, increases inequalities in terms of outcome.
If you need an operation and the NHS is paying for it, but you have to go to a private hospital to get it, why would you care as long as you get it? How could the NHS, which is already struggling to cope if none of these operations would then be done in the private sector?
The evidence is that when you have a privatised or marketised system, the inequalities in terms of accessing health, and this is across...
But that wasn't what I asked you. At the moment, the NHS is struggling with capacity. Part of that capacity is met by getting other hospitals outside the NHS to do it free of the point of use. How could the NHS then take all these operations on?
Then you need to ask why. Yes, we've always said we've always had a plural health system, and where there's need around capacity, of course we would want to make sure that people have access. There was again an open letter in one of the national papers today about a woman with cancer who's had her operation postponed.
No, I saw that. I think you would have to agree we have put these issues to the business.
Yeah, you have very robustly, Andrew.
Because we're nothing if not fair on this programme.